first met Harold Greenberg when I was 19 or 20 years old. I was a film student, and I had gotten a commission to produce a documentary on the Opportunities for Youth program by the federal government, but they didn't give us enough money, so I was looking to make deals wherever I could. Through a mutual friend of my father's, I was given an introduction to Harold, and I went to his office and basically asked him to supply all the lab work on this documentary for free. He listened to my story and said, okay, and picked up the phone, called his lab manager, said, I'm sending this kid down to you, and I want you to give him whatever he wants. And then he hung up. Then he looked at me and says, what else you need? And I said, what? He said, you need cameras? I said, well, maybe some lights. Picked up the phone, called the lighting guy, called me that. What about cars? You want cars? And then he just basically put my whole movie together in about 3 or 4 minutes and 4 or 5 phone calls. And it was a fascinating experience. And the interesting thing was when I had finished the documentary, I brought him a copy of it and a bottle of brandy that I was giving him for thanking him. And he was so touched that I'd actually brought him a gift. He said nobody else he'd ever done favors for had ever given him a gift. So it became the beginning of a very good experience. And I eventually worked with Harold on a number of movies, and always found him to be one of the most generous and giving people I'd ever worked with in this industry. Through my friendship with Harold Greenberg, who knew everybody in Montreal and everybody in the Montreal Jewish community, far more important, the producers and the crew of Duddy Kravitz were having incredible trouble getting any locations because people were suspicious that they were making Duddy Kravitz, which the Jewish population in Montreal did not consider a compliment. They actually thought the book was a bit anti-Semitic, and that Ted Kotcheff, the director, was not Jewish, and they didn't like Mordecai Rickler because they thought that he was making fun of them. So they weren't cooperating. So they couldn't get any locations, any of the real locations. So basically, I was brought in, and they said, "Can you help us secure these locations?" And I would go, "Okay, I need Mo Walensky's lunch. Harold, can you call Mo?" And and Harold would open the door. And I got all these locations for them that were the real deal, and including shooting in the Jewish cemetery and all of those things. So, but it was all, Harold made me look good by opening all those doors. I always refer to John Dunning and Andre Link of Cinepix as my real film school. When I came out of the actual film school, basically I knew enough not to trip over cables, but not very much beyond that. But John Dunning was one of the most amazing creative producers I ever worked with, and Andre Link was one of the smartest financial minds that I've ever met in this industry. And that remains to this day. So Cinepix was kind of like the American International Pictures, or the Roger Corman New World Pictures of Canada, and gave a lot of us young filmmakers a chance. And they basically created who I and David Cronenberg and Ivan Reitman and Danny Goldberg were and later became, along with a number of other filmmakers over the years. Andre Link was directly responsible for my partnership with Ivan Reitman in the early days of making the David Cronenberg movies, and Meatballs and Death Weekend and all those other movies, all the way up to Space Hunter. And John Dunning basically launched David Cronenberg. So they taught me virtually everything I know. But it was shivers. They came from within. When we released the movie, there was an incredible outcry from the critics and politicians. And I still have somewhere buried in all my notes the Hansard, which is the daily log of the parliamentarian chit-chat that went on. And they were just vilifying not only David, but Ivan and myself and John Dunning and Andre Link. And when they found out that both Ivan and I were, not Canadians per se, but immigrants, they wanted to deport us, and David, they just wanted to get committed to a mental hospital. But there was this huge outcry about public money being used to finance horror movies. At the time, a guy called Michael Spencer, who was head of the Canadian Film Development Corporation, which later became Telefilm Canada, stood up and said, an industry is an industry, and it's not based on one type of movie or another. And if we're going to create an industry, we have to be supporting all kinds of films. And he stood up and he took the heat. And also John Dunning prepared a whole broadside of publicity that we launched to sort of combat the film critics, saying, is there a place for horror movies in Canadian cinema? And the very strong argument that there was a place for all types of movies in Canadian cinema. And I think we swayed the general public that way. The picture went on to return money to the Canadian Film Development Corporation, as did RABID and as did The Brood, the subsequent Cronenberg movies. And I just am really amused now, and I tease David relentlessly when I see it. I mean, from wanting to lock him up to now, a Canadian national treasure. It's how times change. Well, I've always tried to make films with an international appeal. I don't try to make films to appeal to a Canadian audience. I make them to appeal to an audience, period, worldwide. So that's what's always fascinated me about the filmmaking process, is to tell a story to a great number of people. I'm not interested in entertaining, a select few people or amusing my friends or whatever. I mean, film is a very expensive medium, and I think that people that trust you with millions of dollars deserve to have a chance of getting it back. So it's very difficult to make a movie for a particular, quadrant, like just Canadians, and make your money back. So it'd be like making a movie just for Australians or, just for Italians. So I've never really been interested in that almost from the get-go. I went back to law school basically because the first movies that I made, we signed terrible distribution agreements. It was basically because we didn't know how to read them. In the early days of Canadian film, there were no entertainment attorneys, so nobody really understood some of these crazy contracts that the studios had. I thought that going back and getting my law degree not to practice law, but basically to be able to write and understand and read contracts properly and negotiate them would be a benefit that would make me a better producer. Goon first is a comedy, and a hockey movie second, and the way we always structured the movie was that it was about relationships and character, and the hockey story was secondary. And when we told the hockey story, we did it, or tried to do it in as universal a manner as possible, so that you did not have to understand the intricacies of hockey. And we helped gloss that over with a lot of extraneous dialogue from the announcer announcing what's going on, like he's in the penalty box for high sticking, and it's, we explain it, but you don't really have to know much about hockey. And what really proved it to us that Goon could appeal to an international audience was when we allowed it to be released in England almost 2 months before the US and Canadian release, because the distributor told us he had a 3-week clear slot and he really thought the picture was going to do it, and they promised to spend a lot of money promoting it. And despite our misgivings, we let them go ahead. And then the picture went on to make over £3 million, which was astonishing for us in a country like England where they didn't play hockey at all or understand it. It proved that the picture just appealed on a comedic level. And since then, we've sold the picture all around the world, not only to the normal places you'd imagine, like Scandinavia and Russia and Finland, but to the Middle East and Australia and Israel and countries like that. So it's been really well received. We're quite happy with it. I love working here because of the crews and the cast and just there's still a fascination with the film industry here, which also translates into lower costs, of course. If I want to shut down a street in Chinatown in New York, it could cost me hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars per day. I want to shoot a street in Chinatown here, and in Toronto, it's maybe a third of that. Again, the crews really care about what movie they're working on. My home in Los Angeles is in Malibu, and it's one of these places that they use all the time for making television shows and movies. And I'll be on my way into town, and I'll see a crew down at the end of the street, and I'll stop because I'll know some guys, and I'll ask them, "What are you working on?" They don't know. They have no idea the name of the show they're working on. That never happens in Toronto. Everybody here knows what they're working on. And I remember in the early days of film in Montreal, when we used to have what were called dailies, where you would go at the end of the day to watch what you shot the day before. And in Hollywood, there would be the script girl, the director, the producer, maybe the director of photography. In Montreal, everybody came, including the coffee boy. And it got so bad sometimes that you had to go, "Look, somebody give the seat to the director." So it was always that kind of interest and belief in what they were doing that always impressed me. And it still holds to this day. There's a great deal of care about what they're doing, and excitement about what they're doing, which is refreshing, and it keeps me young, certainly. So.